There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside abandoned things. Not the silence of a room left empty for an afternoon, but the deeper kind. The silence that accumulates over decades, layer by layer, like dust settling on a thing the world decided to forget. The old Carousel at the end of Birch Road in Hester Falls, Ohio, had been holding that silence for 31 years. Canvas draped over painted horses, a padlock orange with rust, a ticket booth with a caved-in roof and a hand-lettered sign so faded the letters had nearly returned to wood. Nora Calloway was 34 years old and had $43 in her checking account the morning the letter arrived. She had lost her job in March. The apartment she had been renting in Columbus was already spoken for by someone else. The people closest to her had opinions about her situation, and they shared them freely, the way people do when they believe they are being helpful. When the county attorney read the name of what she had been left, a shuttered amusement property, 1.8 acres, assessed value $11,000. There was laughter in the room. Not cruel laughter, just the laughter of people who could not imagine what use a broken carousel would be to anyone. But Clem Garrity had not been in that room. Clem Garrity had been dead for 6 months by then, and he had spent the last 33 years of his life thinking carefully about exactly this kind of moment. The kind of moment that arrives quietly, without announcement, inside a certified envelope. He had learned long ago that the people who need something most are rarely the ones who ask for it. So he did not wait to be asked. He simply prepared. And then he waited. There are men who move through a community the way water moves through limestone, slowly, invisibly, leaving behind something altered that the stone itself does not notice until much later. Clem Garrity was that kind of man. He charged $1 a ride and kept the machine running with his own hands for 33 years. He closed the park on a Tuesday in October of 1991 and padlocked the gate without explanation. The town assumed he had simply run out of reasons to continue. The town was wrong. What Nora Calloway found beneath the center column of that carousel, behind a steel plate, past a second lock, in a fireproof box that smelled of machine oil and old paper, would take the rest of that year to fully understand. It would bring strangers to her door and lawyers to her phone and, eventually, people she had never met who remembered a man she had only known as a name on a deed. Some inheritances are measured in acres, some in dollars, and some in the particular weight of a letter written by a man who trusted that the right person would one day find it and know what to do. The notice from Darby & Sons Collection Agency arrived on a Wednesday. It was the third one that month, and Nora Calloway had stopped opening them by then. She set it on the kitchen counter beside the other two, pressed her palms flat against the laminate, and stood there for a moment looking at nothing in particular. The apartment was quiet. Outside, Columbus moved through its morning without her. She had been let go from her position at Hartwell Fabrication in the second week of March. 18 months of quality control work, and then a Thursday afternoon meeting with a man from HR she had never met before, and then a parking lot, and then her car. The severance was 11 days of pay. She had used it to cover February's rent, which she had already been late on, and a car repair that could not wait. By the time April arrived, she had $43 and some change in her checking account and a landlord who had been patient longer than he needed to be. The apartment on Fielding Street was already spoken for. Her landlord, Mr. Voss, had told her as gently as he knew how. He had a nephew who needed a place by the 1st of May, and he was sorry. He truly was. But there it was. Nora told him she understood. She did understand. She began making calls to her sister in Glendale and to a friend from her Hartwell days who had a spare room in Zanesville. Neither conversation went the way she hoped. There were reasons on both ends, reasonable ones, and she listened to them and said she understood those too. She had been sleeping on a borrowed air mattress at her cousin Deanne's place in Reynoldsburg for 9 days when the letter from the law offices of Strickler and Vane arrived. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, with a return address in Hester Falls, Ohio, a town Nora could not have placed on a map. Her name was typed on the front with the kind of precision that suggested someone had taken care. She opened it standing at Deanne's kitchen table, still in her coat. The letter informed her that she had been named the sole heir and beneficiary of the estate of one Clement Arthur Garrity, late of Hester Falls, Morrow County, Ohio, who had passed on the 14th of November at the age of 81. The estate consisted of a residential parcel at 44 County Road 18 and an adjoining commercial property, 1.8 acres total, last assessed by the county at $11,000. There was a phone number for the attorney, a man named Paul Strickler. There was a date for the reading, a Thursday, 2 weeks out. Nora read the letter twice. Then she sat down. She had heard the name Clem Garrity exactly once before in her life, at her mother's kitchen table sometime in the mid-90s in a conversation she had not been paying attention to. He was her grandmother's brother's son, or something close to that. A gap in the family tree she had never thought to look into. He was old. He lived somewhere rural. That was all she had. The reading was held at Strickler's office on the second floor of a brick building on Hester Falls' main street, a room that smelled of carpet cleaner and old wood. There were 7 people present. Nora knew only one of them, her mother's cousin, Rayette, who had driven up from Chillicothe and who greeted Nora with a hug that lasted a precise amount of time and no longer. The others were neighbors, a former business associate, and a woman from the County Historical Society who had apparently been corresponding with Clem for years about local records. Paul Strickler was a careful man who read slowly and clearly and did not editorialize. He went through the document in order. The house on County Road 18 went to a neighbor named Aldous Bent, who had apparently been maintaining the property for the last 3 years. Several smaller bequests followed. A few $100s here, a piece of equipment there. Then Strickler reached the commercial property. He read Nora's name first, then the description. 1 Carousel pavilion and associated structures, 1.8 acres, all equipment and contents therein, to be transferred in full. There was a pause. Then Rayette made a sound that was not quite a laugh. One of the neighbors, a heavy-set man in a canvas jacket, looked at the floor. Someone else said something under their breath that Nora did not catch. Strickler continued reading, unhurried, as if he had not heard any of it. Nora sat with her hands in her lap and kept her face still. She was good at keeping her face still. Afterward, in the parking lot, Rayette put a hand on Nora's arm and said it was a shame, really, that Clem hadn't had more to leave, and that a person couldn't do much with an old carnival ride, and that if Nora needed help finding somewhere to stay, she should call her mother's sister Linda in Canton, who had a finished basement. Nora thanked her. She meant it, or tried to. She sat in her car for a few minutes after Rayette's taillights disappeared around the corner. She drove out to County Road 18 that same afternoon. The GPS lost confidence somewhere past the grain elevator on Route 36, and she navigated the last mile by a hand-drawn map Strickler had provided without being asked. The road went from asphalt to gravel to packed clay. The tree line came in close on both sides, and then a gap in the trees opened up and she saw it. A canvas-covered pavilion, maybe 40 feet across. The canvas gray-green and sagging in the middle, standing at the end of a crushed limestone lot that had been overtaken on 3 sides by tall grass and volunteer sumac. She got out of the car and stood looking at it for a while. The ticket booth beside the entrance had lost its roof on one side, the sheet metal curled back like a page. A chain-link fence ran the perimeter with a padlocked gate, the padlock brown with rust. There was a hand-lettered wooden sign above the gate, the paint so far gone that only the ghost of letters remained. She could just make out a G and an R, and part of what might have been an ampersand. She tried the padlock out of habit. It didn't move. She stood there with her hand on the cold chain link and looked through the fence at the pavilion, at the canvas, at the place where the wooden floor showed through a gap at the base of the structure, warped but solid. A bird moved somewhere in the eaves. The afternoon was very quiet. Nora Calloway pressed her forehead lightly against the chain link, just for a moment. And then she pushed off and went back to her car to find the key. The Morrow County Recorder's office opened at 8:30 on weekday mornings. Nora was there at 8:40 on a Friday, 2 days after the reading, with a legal pad and a pen she had borrowed from Deanne's kitchen drawer. The woman at the front desk, her nameplate read, Gloria, in capital letters as if emphasis were required, pointed her toward a row of gray metal filing cabinets along the back wall, and told her the commercial parcel index was in the third drawer from the bottom, organized by road name. Nora thanked her and carried her legal pad to the back of the room. The file on the Garrity commercial property was thicker than she expected. It went back to 1958, when Clement Arthur Garrity had purchased 1.8 acres on County Road 18 from a farm estate for $4,200. The deed was handwritten in blue ink, the letters slanting slightly uphill, as if the person writing it had been quietly optimistic. Nora ran her finger along the property description without touching the paper. She wrote down the date and the purchase price and the name of the seller, a woman named Opal Truesdale, whose signature was careful and deliberate at the bottom of the page. The file told the story in layers. In 1959, Clem had applied for and received a county amusement license, listing one Mangles Illions Carousel, 36 figures, manufactured approximately 1923. Acquired from the Hartley Brothers Traveling Show's liquidation sale in Sandusky. The licensing fee had been $12. An inspector's notation from that same year read, "Machine in fair mechanical condition. Owner has demonstrated working knowledge of drive mechanism. Approved for public operation at owner's discretion." Nora copied it down word for word. Through the 1960s and 70s, the file thickened with annual renewals, each one stamped and dated, each one showing a $2 increase in the licensing fee every few years. There were inspection reports in 1964, 1971, and 1979, the last one signed by an inspector named R. Bowen, who noted that the Carousel's center column bearing had been replaced with a non-original part, machined locally, and who added in a handwritten aside that the replacement was, in his opinion, cleaner work than the factory original. Nora paused on that line and read it again. The gap she was looking for appeared between 1979 and 1986. No inspections, no renewals. A single letter from the county health office dated March of 1980 asking for confirmation that the property was still in operation. No response was recorded. Then in the spring of '86, a new license application. The same property, the same machine, the same owner. In the blank for reason of lapse, Clem had written 4 words, "Family matter, now resolved." Nora wrote that down too. The renewal stamps continued through the late '80s without interruption, each one a small bureaucratic confirmation that the machine was still turning, that the man was still there, that the quarter-a-ride carousel on County Road 18 had not yet been swallowed by the trees. Then the last stamp, September of 1991. And after it, nothing. No closure notice filed by the owner, no county action. Just a State Highway Department letter from October of that year informing property owners along the old Route 36 corridor that the new bypass alignment had been finalized and that through traffic would be rerouted beginning the following spring. The letter was addressed to Clement A. Garrity. It had not been returned. Nora set her pen down and looked at the far wall for a moment. The fluorescent light above her buzzed once, then settled. She picked up the pen. Gloria at the front desk pointed her toward the tax records room, which was down a short hallway and smelled permanently of toner and old carpet. The property tax ledgers for County Road 18 showed a consistent record. Paid without exception, from 1958 through the year of Clem's death. The amounts were small. The commercial assessment had never been high, and the parcel had declined in assessed value steadily after the bypass rerouted traffic away from the area. By the early 2000s, the annual tax bill had dropped to $214. It had been paid each year by check, mailed from a post office box in Hester Falls, arriving reliably before the due date. She found the newspaper archive at the Hester Falls Public Library, 3 blocks from the recorder's office, in a reading room with oak tables and a window that looked out on a parking lot with a single tree. The librarian, a younger man named Doug, who wore a cardigan the color of old mustard, pulled the relevant years on microfiche without being asked twice. Nora worked through the reels slowly, beginning in 1959. The Carousel appeared in the Hester Falls Courier exactly 4 times over 3 decades. A brief notice in the summer of '59 announcing its opening, with a photograph too faded to read clearly. A letter to the editor in '67 from a woman who said that Garrity's Park was the only reason her children had anything to look forward to on summer Saturdays. A small feature in 1974, on the occasion of the Carousel's estimated 50,000th ride, which included a photograph of Clem standing beside the machine with his arms at his sides, and his expression suggesting he would have preferred not to be photographed, and a 4-paragraph notice in October of '91, headlined, "Garrity's Park to close," which said only that the property would cease operations at the end of the season and that no reason had been provided by the owner. Nora printed the photograph from '74 on the library's machine for 15 cents. Clem Garrity was somewhere in his early 40s in it, lean and dark-haired, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was not smiling, but there was something in the set of his jaw that was not unhappy either. Behind him, the Carousel horses were mid-rotation, blurred by the camera's exposure, a long streak of painted color. She folded the print carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. On her way out, Doug looked up from the desk and asked if she had found what she was looking for. Nora thought about it for a moment. She told him she had found most of it. He nodded as if that were a reasonable answer, which she supposed it was. She pushed through the glass door into the cold air of the parking lot, her legal pad dense with notes, the afternoon light already going thin and gray above the tree line to the west. She sat in her car and read back through what she had written. The numbers arranged themselves into a shape she could almost see. 32 years of operation, a quarter a ride, the machine running on summer weekends and school holidays, a man maintaining it alone with locally machined parts and inspectors who noted the quality of his work. She did the arithmetic slowly, on a blank page, and then looked at what she had written, and did it again. It was not a small number. She set the legal pad on the passenger seat and started the car, and sat for another moment with the engine running before she put it in gear. She left Reynoldsburg at 6:40 on a Tuesday morning, before Deanne was awake. The air mattress had deflated by about a third during the night, the way it always did, and she had lain on the gradually firming floor, listening to the neighborhood collect itself. A dog, a truck, someone's garbage cans, until the sky outside the basement window went from black to gray, and she decided that was enough. She left a note on the kitchen table that said she would be back by dark, or she would call. She took her work gloves and her pry bar and the shop light she had bought second-hand at the Reynoldsburg flea market for $7. She took the key from the attorney's envelope, which she had been keeping in the inside pocket of her jacket alongside the photograph of Clem. Route 33 carried her east out of Columbus through the flat commercial fringe of the city. Storage facilities, discount furniture warehouses, a row of fast food signs rising above the tree line like a low-grade fever. She passed through Kirkersville without stopping, and then the landscape began to open up into proper farmland, fields of last year's corn stubble running to the horizon, the soil dark and damp with early spring. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the trees along the fence lines were still bare, their branches making the same fine, scratched pattern against the sky that they made every year at this time, patient and unchanged. Nora kept both hands on the wheel and let the road run under her. She picked up County Road 18 north of Marengo, where the GPS showed a clean blue line turning off the state route onto something it rendered as a thin gray thread. The pavement held for the first mile, cracked and frost-heaved but navigable, then gave way to gravel at a point marked by a green county sign with a reflective number that had been partially obscured by a branch no one had gotten around to trimming. She slowed the truck and felt the gravel under the tires, loose at first, and then more packed as the road settled into its older habits. A red-tailed hawk sat on a fence post at the edge of a field and watched her pass without moving. The gravel thinned to packed clay around the 2-mile mark, where the road curved left through a stand of mature oaks whose roots had been lifting the surface for decades. She felt the truck's front end move in a way that reminded her the alignment needed attention she had not yet been able to afford. She kept her speed at under 15 miles an hour and let the road tell her what it wanted. A creek crossed under the road through a culvert that had been patched with poured concrete at some point, the patch a different color from the original pipe, pale against rust. Water ran dark and cold below it, not much but steady. A sign appeared on the right side of the road, nailed to a fence post at a slight angle, as if it had been hit by something and never straightened. It was wooden, painted white with green lettering, and it read, "Garrity's Park," with an arrow pointing left, deeper into the tree line. The paint had weathered down to a whisper in most places, but the arrow was still legible if you were looking for it. Nora stopped the truck and sat with the engine idling and looked at the sign for a moment. She had known it was there. Paul Strickler had mentioned it, but knowing and seeing were different things. She turned left. The track that opened before her was barely a road. 2 parallel ruts in the clay, with a strip of tall dead grass running up the center that scraped the undercarriage as she moved through it. Sumac had come in on both sides, thick and close, the thin red stalks bright against the gray morning. A cedar tree had fallen across the right rut at some point and been cut with a chainsaw and dragged aside, the cut end still pale and clean-looking, maybe a year old at most. Someone had been out here, at least once not so long ago. She filed that away. The tree line broke open ahead of her, and the property appeared. It was larger than it had looked from the gate 2 days before, or maybe it was the angle. The full 1.8 acres of crushed limestone lot visible now. The limestone gone mostly to weeds and grass, with the gravel showing through in patches like old scalp. The pavilion stood at the center of the lot, round and perhaps 40 feet across, with its canvas covering draped from a central peak, the canvas sagging in the middle where water had pooled and stretched the fabric over the years. The peak itself was a wooden finial, octagonal, painted green, and it was the only thing on the property that still had color that looked intentional. She parked and got out and stood in the quiet for a moment. The morning was cold enough that her breath showed. A pair of crows moved in the oaks at the edge of the lot and then settled. The chain-link fence ran the full perimeter, 8 feet high, the kind with the diamond pattern wire that caught light in a particular way. A section on the east side had come loose from one of its posts and bowed outward, not broken but leaning, the wire holding its own weight without assistance. The ticket booth sat just inside the entrance gate. The roof caved on one side, a spill of rusted sheet metal on the ground below the collapsed section. One wall of the booth had a window with a sliding panel, the kind with a half-circle cutout at the bottom for passing change through, and the panel was still in its track, closed. She used the key from the attorney's envelope on the padlock at the gate. It went in cleanly and turned without resistance, which surprised her. She had expected corrosion, argument from the mechanism. The padlock opened with a sound that was almost a click and almost something else. She unwound the chain from the gateposts and pushed the gate inward, the hinges protesting with a low sound that carried across the empty lot. And then she walked through. The crushed limestone crunched under her boots. She walked slowly, looking at the ground, at the pavilion, at the fence line, making a first pass the way she had learned to do on factory floors before signing off on a quality inspection. Perimeter first, then work inward. The pavilion's cedar shingles were what stopped her. She had registered them from the gate 2 days earlier as wrong, as a thing that did not match. And standing close now, she could see clearly what she had sensed from a distance. The shingles were new. Not new. They had weathered to silver at the edges, but they were sound and tight and had been installed with a consistent reveal of about 5 inches, the way a careful person did it. Below the eave line, she could see where the old shingles had been stripped, the scar line still visible against the original fascia board. Someone had re-roofed this pavilion within the last 5 or 6 years. Someone had climbed a ladder and stripped the old cedar and replaced it course by course, working alone most likely, on a property that had been closed for 3 decades. She put her hand against one of the shingles and pressed. Solid. The wood had no give in it, no soft spots, no rot beneath the surface. She stood with her hand flat against the cedar for a moment and then dropped it, and looked up at the peak of the pavilion, at the green finial against the gray sky. And she thought about a man in his late 70s on a ladder, working without an audience, re-roofing a building that everyone else had written off. She did not say anything. There was no one to say it to. She picked up the pry bar from where she had set it against the fence post and walked to the pavilion door. The pavilion door was a double barn-style panel, each half hung on its own track, with a hasp and a second padlock that used the same key as the gate. Nora worked the lock free and slid the left panel back along its track. The track was clean. No grit, no rust sees. It moved with a low rumble that ended in a solid stop against the buffer at the end of the rail. She stood in the open doorway and let her eyes adjust. The interior was dark except for 3 places where the canvas had pulled away from its grommets, and daylight came through in pale diagonal bars, catching dust and the occasional slow drift of something she could not identify. She set up the shop light on its folding stand just inside the door and ran the cord back to the truck's inverter. The bulb came on with a hum and threw a wide white circle across the interior, and for the first time, Nora saw the carousel hole. It filled nearly the entire pavilion floor, its platform perhaps 30 feet across. The horses arranged in 3 concentric rings on their brass poles, 36 of them, each one hand-carved and individually painted. The paint was faded. Yes, the red's gone to salmon, the blues to gray. The gold leaf on the saddle horns reduced to a dull suggestion. But the figures themselves were intact. Every horse. Not one was missing. Not one had fallen from its pole. Not one had lost a leg or a head to time or weather or casual vandalism. They stood in their rings in the dark like things that had been waiting patiently for the light to come back. She walked the perimeter of the platform before stepping onto it, keeping her boots on the concrete apron that ran around the base of the machine. The platform edge was a band of alternating maple and walnut, the parquet pattern still visible under a coat of grime that had gone the same gray-brown color as everything else. She crouched at one point and rubbed a patch of the floor with the heel of her glove. The wood came up clean beneath, tight grain, no warping, no soft spots. The platform had been sealed at some point with something that had held. She pressed the heel of her boot against the edge and felt no give. The center column rose from the middle of the platform to the pavilion's peak, a steel pipe about 8 inches in diameter wrapped in a decorative cast-iron sleeve that had been painted cream at some point and had since gone the color of old bone. At the base of the column, where it met the platform, a ring of turned wooden panels formed a low decorative skirt. Each panel, maybe 18 inches wide, and fitted tongue and groove into its neighbors. She ran her hand along the panels as she walked around the column. They were solid. The joints were tight. She tapped each one with her knuckle as she went, listening to the tone, hollow, hollow, hollow. And then, at the panel directly facing the pavilion's rear wall, something slightly different. Not hollow exactly. Full. She pulled her hand back and tapped again, once, then twice. The difference was subtle. She might have missed it if she had been moving faster or thinking about something else. She marked the panel in her mind and kept moving around the column, finishing the circuit, not rushing. When she came back around, she crouched in front of the panel again and looked at it carefully. The tongue and groove joint on its left side had a hairline gap, barely the width of a thumbnail, and at the bottom of the panel, where it met the platform floor, the edge showed a faint mark that was not dirt. It was wear. The kind of wear that came from something being opened and closed many times over many years. She did not try to force it. She stood up and turned and looked at the rest of the pavilion instead, making herself useful while she thought. Along the back wall, a workbench had been built from 2x12 Douglas fir, 8 feet long, with a full-width shelf above it and a row of J-hooks below the shelf for hanging tools. The tools were still there. A ball-peen hammer, a pipe wrench with a jaw set to 2.5 inches, a set of open-end wrenches on a wire ring, a can of liquid wrench so old the label had faded to illegibility, and a 3/8-inch socket wrench with the rubber grip worn smooth on the inside of the handle where a right hand had closed around it thousands of times. On the shelf above, a coffee can of mixed hardware, a roll of electrical tape gone brittle, 3 spare drive belts in graduated sizes still in their original waxed paper wrappers, and a spiral-bound maintenance log with a red cover. She took the log down and opened it. The entries were in a small, upright hand, dates on the left margin, and notes to the right. The earliest entry she could find was from June of 1962. Replaced drive belt, center sheave, adjusted tension, runs smooth. The last entry was September 28, 1991. Drained oil reservoir, blocked platform, covered canvas, locked up. That was it. The final entry was matter of fact, the way you wrote a thing you expected to return to, and then did not. She put the log back on the shelf, spine out, the way she had found it. She turned back to the decorative panel at the base of the center column. She tried pressure first, a firm push at the center, and then at each corner. Nothing moved. Then she ran her fingers along the full perimeter of the panel, feeling for a catch or a spring. At the upper right corner, beneath a small carved rosette detail, her thumbnail caught the edge of something recessed. She pressed it. A small lever, maybe an inch long, pivoted inward. There was a resistance, a spring-loaded resistance, and then a sound. Not quite a click, more like a release, a breath. And the panel shifted outward along its left edge by about 1/4 of an inch. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the gap. She could feel her pulse in her hands. She did not pull the panel open immediately. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed for a moment, looking at the thin line of darkness where the panel had separated from the column. Then she stood up and went back to the truck and got her headlamp from the glove box, the one she kept for roadside emergencies, and she put it on her head and adjusted the strap and came back inside. She crouched in front of the panel again and worked her fingers into the gap and pulled gently. The panel swung outward on a pair of concealed hinges, smooth and without complaint, as if the mechanism had been oiled recently. Behind it was not the hollow cavity she might have expected from a decorative element. What she found instead was a steel plate, fitted flush into the column itself, with 3 lag bolts driven into it and a second lock set into the plate's center. A separate lock. a combination padlock, 4-digit. The body of it heavy and dull and cold to the touch. None of the keys in the estate envelope would be for this. She had no combination. The padlock turned in her hand, solid and absolute, and gave nothing. Nora sat on the platform floor with her back against the center column and her legs stretched out in front of her and looked at the horses. The shoplight made long shadows behind each figure, the shadows pointing away from her in a ring like spokes. She wiped her face on the back of her hand and sat there for a while without moving. The pavilion quiet around her, the horses waiting the same way they had been waiting for 31 years. She was going to need the drawings. She just did not know that yet. She drove into Hester Falls proper for the first time on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the reading. She had been back to the property 4 times since finding the steel plate and the combination lock, each visit adding another layer of careful observation without resolving the central problem. She had no combination. The estate paperwork had yielded nothing. No note, no number written on the back of anything. No envelope taped inside the maintenance log. She had gone through the log page by page, tilting it under the headlamp, looking for impressions in the paper or marginalia she might have missed. Nothing. She had sat with that fact long enough to stop being frustrated by it and start thinking around it instead. The drawings were the next logical step. The drawings Strickler had mentioned, the ones Clem had left somewhere for safekeeping, might show her what was behind that steel plate and give her something to work with. Dunbar's Feed and Hardware occupied a building on the south end of Hester Falls Main Street that appeared to have been continuously occupied by some form of commerce since approximately 1910. The facade was red brick with a painted sign above the door that had been repainted enough times to have a slight dimensional quality, the letters raised by accumulated coats. 2 pickup trucks were parked in front. A stack of 50-pound mineral blocks sat under the overhang to the left of the entrance, and a wire rack of work gloves stood just inside the door. The kind of rack that spun on a central axis and had been doing so in hardware stores since before most people alive could remember. The store smelled of seed and oil and something metallic, clean and faintly sharp. The smell of a place where functional things were bought by people who used them. Earl Dunbar was behind the counter at the back of the store, entering something in a ledger with a mechanical pencil. He was 71 years old, though Nora did not know that yet. She learned it later, from the same woman who told her about the furnace. He was lean in the way that men who have worked physically their whole lives are lean, not spare but efficient. No part of him wasted. He wore a canvas apron over a flannel shirt, and he did not look up immediately when Nora came in, finishing the entry he was on before he raised his eyes. When he did, he looked at her directly, the way people in small towns sometimes look at strangers. Not unfriendly, just honest about the fact of her being new. She asked for lag screws, 3/8 by 3 inch, and PVC primer, the small can. He turned and found both without consulting anything. The screws in a bin on the wall behind him, the primer on the second shelf of a rack to his left. He set them on the counter and told her the total was $4.60. She paid with a 5 and he counted back the change. She put the coins in her jacket pocket and then she said, because there was no useful way to build toward it gradually. She had inherited the Garrity property on County Road 18. She was trying to understand what she had. Earl Dunbar set his mechanical pencil down on the ledger. He did it slowly, the way a person sets something down when they want their hands free for whatever comes next. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, not weighing her exactly. More like arriving at something he had already halfway decided. Then he said, "How long have you been in town?" She said she was staying in Reynoldsburg, just coming out when she could. He nodded once and said, "You had better come around back." The back room of Dunbar's Feed and Hardware was a workspace as much as a storeroom. A long table running the center, shelving on 3 walls floor to ceiling, boxes stacked with a system that was visible if you took a moment to look. Earl went to the shelving along the left wall and moved 2 boxes of wire staples and a rolled-up equipment catalog. And behind them, flat against the wall, was a cardboard tube about 3 feet long, capped at both ends, with plastic caps. The tube itself, wrapped in a layer of brown craft paper that had been taped carefully and had gone the color of old honey. He brought it to the table and set it down and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. He said that Clem had brought the tube in on a September afternoon in 1989 and asked him to keep it somewhere dry. He had not said what was in it. Earl had not asked. He had put it behind the staples because the staples never moved, and there it had stayed. When Clem died, Earl said, he had wondered about the tube but had not known who to give it to or whether giving it was his place. He said this plainly, without apology, the way a person accounts for a reasonable decision that events had made complicated. Then he slid the tube across the table toward Nora. She pulled the craft paper away carefully. The cardboard tube beneath was the kind used by architects and engineers, blue-gray with a friction-fit cap. She worked the cap off and tilted the tube, and a roll of papers slid out onto the table. 3 sheets, large format, folded once lengthwise. The paper a cream-colored bond that had yellowed slightly at the edges but remained supple. She unfolded them on the table, and Earl moved a box of bolts to give her room. The drawings were mechanical, hand-drafted in ink, with title blocks in the lower right corner of each sheet. The title block read, Mangles Illions Portable Carousel, 36 figure circa 1923. As-built survey and modification record, C.A. Garrity, completed August 1988. Clem had drawn the machine from memory and measurement, every component recorded in a clean architectural hand. The drive mechanism was there, the center column assembly, the figure suspension rods, the electrical schematic for the motor. On the 3rd sheet, a detailed drawing of the center column base, dimensioned and annotated, showed the decorative wooden skirt panels in section. And behind one of them, drawn in a fine line with a small note in Clem's hand that read secondary access, combination required, a rectangle the size of a large briefcase set into the column itself. Below the rectangle, in the same careful hand, see envelope. Nora looked up from the drawing. Earl was watching her with his hands in his apron pockets. She asked if there had been an envelope with the tube. He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned back to the shelving and moved the wire staples again, and looked behind them, and then along the shelf to the left, and found, tucked flat against the wall behind a box of fence clips that had not been touched in years, an envelope the same color as the craft paper wrapping, taped shut, with a single word on the front in the same upright hand as the maintenance log, Garrity. He put it on the table beside the drawings. Nora looked at it. She looked at Earl. He said, I forgot it was there. She believed him. She believed him completely, without hesitation, because it was exactly the kind of thing that happened. A thing put away so carefully it became invisible. A thing waiting behind other things for years until the right person came looking. She reached for the envelope and then stopped and pressed her fingers flat on the table for a moment. She asked Earl what she owed him. He shook his head once. She said she meant for the storage, for keeping them all those years. He shook his head again and said, Clem would have wanted you to have those. That was all he said. She picked up the envelope and the drawings and held them against her chest for a moment before she began to fold the drawings back along their creases. Earl moved the boxes back into place on the shelf without being asked. When she left, he was already back at his ledger, the mechanical pencil in his hand. And he did not make a production of the farewell. The envelope held a single index card. On it, in Clem's upright hand, were 4 numbers separated by dashes. 7, 22, 14, 3. Below the numbers, 1 line. Turn left to clear between each. That was all. No explanation, no salutation, no signature. Nora sat in the truck outside Dunbar's and read the card twice, then folded it into the breast pocket of her jacket alongside the photograph. She unrolled the third drawing across the steering wheel and found the detail of the steel plate again, the dimensioned rectangle behind the panel, and beneath it Clem's notation. She measured the drawing with her thumb and forefinger, estimating. The space behind the plate was roughly 14 inches by 20 inches by 8 inches deep. She rolled the drawings and capped the tube and put it on the passenger seat and drove back out County Road 18 without stopping. She arrived at the property at 11:30. The morning had warmed slightly, enough that the frost was gone from the grass in the open parts of the lot, though it lingered in the shadow of the fence line on the north side. She carried the tube and her tool bag through the gate and across the limestone to the pavilion, slid the barn door back along its clean track, and set up the shop light the way she always did now, the stand positioned to throw light toward the center column without creating a direct glare. The horses stood in their rings. She had stopped being startled by them after the second visit. Now they were simply there, the way furniture is simply there in a room you know well. She crouched in front of the access panel, pressed the recessed lever behind the carved rosette, and heard the release. The panel swung outward on its concealed hinges with the same unhurried compliance it had shown before. The steel plate was there behind it, dull gray, the 3 lag bolts in their positions, the combination lock centered between them. She brought the index card out of her breast pocket and read it once more under the headlamp, then put it away. She took the lock body in her left hand, and with her right she began working the dial. Left to clear, 7, right to 22, left to 14, right to 3. The lock did not open. She held it for a moment, then cleared it again, 4 full rotations left, and started over. Slower this time, feeling the dial's detunts as she moved through each number. 7, 22, 14, 3. She pulled. Nothing. She set the lock down against the plate and pressed her fists against her thighs and looked at the ceiling of the pavilion for a moment, at the underside of the new cedar shingles, at the purlins running between the rafters, at the green-painted finial casting a shadow against the canvas above. She picked the lock up again and tried the sequence in reverse. 3, 14, 22, 7. It did not open. She tried right, left. Same result. She went to her tool bag and got the drawing tube and unrolled the third sheet on the platform floor, weighting the corners with the ball-peen hammer and the pipe wrench from Clem's workbench. She read the annotation again. Secondary access, combination required. And then she looked at the detail more carefully, at the fine lines around the lock symbol. There was a small mark she had taken for a smudge the first time, but under the headlamp it resolved into a letter. An R, circled with an arrow. Start right. She had been starting left to clear. She folded the drawing back and picked up the lock. Right to clear. 4 full rotations. Right to 7. Left to 22. Right to 14. Left to 3. She pulled. The shackle released with a sound like a single knuckle cracking, clean and final, and the lock came open in her hand. She stayed crouched in front of the plate and did not move for a moment. Then she set the open lock on the platform floor beside her and got the socket wrench from the workbench and found the right drive in the coffee can. 3/8 inch square drive, the fit snug in the lag bolt heads. She broke each bolt loose in sequence, counterclockwise, feeling the initial resistance give way to free rotation, the bolts backing out of the column in long, smooth threads that she caught with her free hand one by one and set in a row on the platform. The steel plate pivoted out from the bottom on a pair of barrel hinges, swinging down and settling against the column skirt with a soft clang. The space behind it was lined on 3 sides with 1/4-inch steel plate, welded at the seams, and it had the faint smell of machine oil and something older beneath that, dry paper perhaps. or the particular smell of currency that has been held and handled and then put away in the dark for a long time. Inside, sitting flush against the back wall of the cavity, were two things. A fireproof document box, gray, the kind sold at office supply stores, with a combination dial on its latch that was set to 0, and beside it, resting flat, two canvas bank bags of the sort that savings institutions used through the 1970s and 80s, each one cinched with a drawstring and showing the impressed stamp of the First Savings Bank of Morrow County. Nora reached in and touched the canvas bag nearest to her. It had weight. She did not lift it yet. She put her hand on the document box instead, felt the cold of the steel, the slight roughness of its painted surface. She did not open either one. She sat back on the platform floor with her spine against the center column and her legs out in front of her and the open cavity visible to her left, and she looked at the horses again, at the 36 figures on their brass poles, at the faded reds and the dim gilding and the particular stillness of carved wood that has been standing in the same position for decades. The shop light hummed. A wind moved through the property outside and the canvas above her shifted and settled. She could hear the trees. The afternoon was going. The bars of light that came through the loose grommets had traveled several feet across the floor since she had arrived, the way they always did, measuring time in slow diagonal lines across the concrete apron. She was aware of her own breathing, the particular slowness of it, the way it had settled without her deciding it should. She wiped her face on the back of her hand. Then she reached back into the cavity and lifted out the document box and set it carefully on the platform floor in front of her. It was heavier than it looked, a good sign, a sign that it was not empty. The latch dial was on 0. She tried 000, and the latch did not move. She looked at the index card again. 7, 22, 14, 3. She tried the sequence on the document box dial. The latch turned and the box opened. Inside, on top of everything else, was a letter. 6 pages, handwritten on lined paper. The pages numbered in the upper right corner, the ink brown at the edges where the years had worked on it. The date at the top of the first page was August 3rd, 1991. The salutation read, "To whoever has come this far." She lifted the pages out of the box and held them in both hands under the headlamp and began to read. She did not rush. The light moved across the floor and she did not notice. The horses stood in their rings around her and she did not look up. The letter was dated August 3rd, 1991, written on 6 pages of college-ruled notebook paper in the same upright hand as the maintenance log and the index card. The handwriting was steady throughout, not the cramped or wandering script of a man writing in difficulty, but the deliberate hand of someone who had thought carefully about what he wanted to say and was taking his time saying it. Nora held the pages in both hands under the headlamp and read from the beginning without skipping. "Oh, to whoever has come this far," the letter began. "If you are reading this, you found the drawings, or you found someone who knew where they were, or you were patient enough to work it out another way. Any of those tells me something about you. I am glad it is you and not someone else. I do not know your name, but I know something about your situation, or you would not have been the one to inherit this property, and I would ask you to keep reading before you decide what any of this means. My name is Clement Arthur Garrity. I was born in Hester Falls in 1910, and I have lived here my entire life, except for 3 years in the Pacific during the war, which I do not intend to discuss. I bought this property in 1958 with money I had saved working at the Holton Brothers grain elevator for 11 years. I bought the Carousel from a traveling show that was liquidating its equipment in Sandusky, and I brought it home on a flatbed truck, and I assembled it myself over the course of one winter with a manual that was missing its last 12 pages. I opened the following June. I charged $0.25 a ride. I never raised the price." Nora turned to the second page. "I ran this machine for 32 years, And in that time I gave a great many rides to a great many children, some of whom could pay, and some of whom could not. I did not distinguish between them at the gate. A child who could not pay rode the same horse as a child who could, and I did not make a record of either one. I want to be plain about why I am telling you this. Not because I want credit for it, but because it is the context for what is in the box beside this letter, and you deserve to understand how it got there. In the summer of 1963, a woman named Vera Ashcraft brought her 3 children to the park on a Saturday afternoon. She had 65 cents. There were 3 children, and at a quarter apiece that was not enough for all 3 to ride. She was going to give the money to the 2 older ones and tell the youngest to watch. I saw this from where I was standing, and I waved all 3 through and told her to keep her money for ice cream. She cried a little, which embarrassed us both, and I made a point of looking at something else until she had composed herself. She came back the following Saturday and tried to pay me twice over. I would not take it. We never discussed it again. Her youngest, whose name was Denny, came back every summer until he was too old to think it was acceptable, and then he came back anyway for 2 more years after that. He painted horses for me one summer at $1.10 an hour, and he did good work. I want you to know that because it matters to the accounting. Page 3. Nora shifted her position on the platform floor, straightening her back against the center column. The accounting is this. Over 32 years of operation, I kept a portion of each week's receipts separate from my operating costs and personal expenses. Not a fixed percentage. What was left after the machine was maintained and the property taxes were paid, and I had enough to live on, which was never very much, because I live simply and always have. I kept this remainder in the 2 canvas bags you will find in this box, adding to them each season, and in the years when I had more than the bags would comfortably hold, I converted the surplus to Series EE savings bonds through the post office in Cardington, which are also in the box. The total, as of the date of this letter, is $61,400 between the cash and the bonds at current face value. Nora stopped. She read the sentence again. Then she kept reading. I am closing the park this October because the state has moved the highway and there will be no more through traffic on this road. And without through traffic, there is no park. I am 61 years old and in reasonable health, but I am not a fool about time. I could reopen in a smaller way or find another arrangement, but I have thought about it, and I believe the right thing is to close properly and to leave what I have accumulated for the person who will need it most. I have no children. My wife, Ruth, died in 1978. The people I might have left this to directly are either gone or situated well enough that this money would be a surprise rather than a necessity. I am not interested in surprising comfortable people. Page 4. I have arranged with Paul Strickler, whose father handled my affairs before him, to identify the heir who is in the most reduced circumstances at the time of my death, within the family as he can determine it, and to leave the property to that person. I have told Paul only that the property has sentimental value and that I want it kept in the family. I have not told him about what is inside because I did not want the information to travel before the right person arrived. If you are reading this letter, Paul did his job, and you are the one he found. The money is yours without condition, with one exception, which I will come to. I am not leaving it to you because I think you cannot manage without it, though perhaps you cannot right now, which is all right. Most people cannot manage at some point in their lives, and it does not mean anything permanent about them. I am leaving it to you because 32 years of quarter rides and 1 summer of horse painting and a great many other small transactions with the people of this county have added up to something, and that something belongs to the next person who needs it, whoever they turn out to be. That is how I have always understood the arrangement. Page 5. Outside, the wind moved through the lot again, and the canvas above shifted. The one condition is this. Keep some portion of what is here. I leave the amount to your judgment, and use it to do one thing for one person who cannot do it for themselves without telling them where it came from. Not a large thing necessarily. Sometimes a small thing at the right moment is the larger thing. You will know it when you see it because it will be the kind of situation where most people look away. I am asking you not to look away. After that, the remainder is entirely yours and you owe me nothing, and you owe no one an explanation. The park itself, I leave to your judgment also. The machine is sound. I re-roofed the pavilion in '87 and again in the fall of '89, and the cedar should hold for another 20 years with reasonable attention. The drive belt will need replacing before the machine can run again. The spare belts on the shelf above the workbench are the correct size. The motor is a 1-horsepower Leeson, single-phase, and it was rewound in '74 by a man in Mount Gilead, whose name I have lost but whose work has held. I believe the machine can run again if someone wants it to. Whether that someone is you is your business and not mine. Page 6. The last page. The handwriting the same throughout, steady to the end. I have had a good life in this town. Not an easy life in all its parts, but a good one. And the difference between those two things took me a long time to understand. The carousel helped me understand it. A machine that goes around and comes back to the same place, always, in every weather, for as long as someone tends it. There is something in that worth thinking about. I have thought about it for 32 years, and I am still not finished. Thank you for coming out here. Thank you for being the kind of person who opens the drawings and finds the panel and works out the combination. I hope this helps. I believe it will. Yours sincerely, Clement Arthur Garrity, Hester Falls, Ohio, August 3rd, 1991. Nora held the last page in both hands for a long time after she finished reading. The shop light hummed. The horses stood in their rings. She did not wipe her face. She just sat there on the pavilion floor with the letter in her hands and the open box beside her and the 2 canvas bags waiting. And she let the silence be what it was. 3 days after she found the letter, Nora drove back to Columbus and opened a new checking account at a branch she had not used before, at a bank where she had no existing relationship and no overdraft history on file. She deposited $4,000 in cash from one of the canvas bags, enough to establish the account and give herself a working cushion, and took the remainder back to the property, where she had begun keeping the document box in the locked truck cab during her working hours. She had called Paul Strickler from a payphone outside a gas station on Route 36 and told him in general terms what she had found. He had been quiet for a moment and then said he would need to look into the proper procedure for declaring found assets from an estate and that she should not make any large moves with the bonds until he had a clearer picture. She said she understood. She had not told him the full amount. The work on the property had been giving her days a shape they had lacked since March. She had cleared the sumac from the east fence line with a pruning saw and a pair of loppers she bought at Dunbar's for $11, working in sections, stacking the cut stems in a pile at the north edge of the lot where they could season before burning. She had replaced 3 sections of the chain link that had pulled free from their posts, using new tension bands and carriage bolts. The work straightforward and satisfying in the particular way that work with a clear before and after is always satisfying. She had begun cleaning the carousel horses from the outside ring inward, using a soft brush and a bucket of warm water mixed with a small amount of Murphy oil soap, working on 1 horse per session, finding beneath the grime the specific colors Clem had applied or had paid someone to apply. Cobalt blue on one saddle, a dark hunter green on another, chrome yellow on the carved mane of a horse in the middle ring that turned out to have a small maker's mark pressed into the underside of its base. She was on her knees beside the 3rd horse of the outer ring, working at the carved detail of its breastplate with an old toothbrush, when she heard a vehicle on the access track. She heard it from some distance. The sumac was thinner now and sound traveled differently across the cleared lot, and she listened to it without stopping her work. The engine was quieter than a pickup, smoother, the sound of something newer and heavier. It stopped outside the gate. A door opened and closed. She heard the gate chain, and then footsteps on the limestone, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who was not concerned about being heard. The man who appeared in the pavilion doorway was perhaps 60 years old, in a wool overcoat the color of charcoal, with a collared shirt beneath it and no tie. He was not large, but he carried himself with the particular ease of someone accustomed to entering rooms first. He looked around the pavilion with what appeared to be genuine interest, at the horses, at the platform, at the shop light on its stand, before he looked at Nora. When he did, he smiled. It was a courteous smile, the kind that had been practiced until it arrived without effort. He introduced himself as Gerald Pact, of Pact Development out of Columbus. He said he hoped he was not interrupting, which they both understood was not a serious concern of his. He said he had been watching the Hester Falls corridor for some time, and that the Garrity parcel had been on his radar for several years, and that when the estate transfer came through the county records, he had made a point of coming out. He said all of this in an even, moderate tone, the tone of a man conducting an ordinary professional call. He did not ask how she had been spending her time on the property. He did not comment on the cleaned horses or the repaired fence. He looked at the carousel once more, and then back at Nora. He said he was prepared to make an offer of $38,000 for the parcel, land and structures included, as is, with a 30-day close. He said it was a fair number given the access limitations and the county's current assessment, and that he had a title company already familiar with the property. He mentioned, in the same even tone, that the Carousel's amusement certification had lapsed in '91 and that recertifying a machine of its age would involve a mechanical inspection process that could be involved and expensive, and that the county had occasionally exercised its discretion on structures that sat unused for extended periods on commercially zoned land. He said this without emphasis, the way a person mentions weather, as information, not as pressure. He left his card on the workbench beside Clem's coffee can of hardware and told her to take her time. Nora watched him walk back across the lot to the gate. He moved at the same unhurried pace in both directions. His car was a dark green Buick LeSabre, current model, clean. He backed it along the access track without difficulty, and she listened to the engine note diminish through the sumac until the property was quiet again. She stood in the doorway of the pavilion for a moment, and then she went back to the horse with the toothbrush. She finished the breastplate detail and moved down to the foreleg, working the bristles into the carved muscle lines. And she thought about what he had said and what he had not said, and after a while she put the toothbrush in the bucket and went to the workbench and picked up his card and looked at it. She taped it to the wall above the workbench with a strip of the brittle electrical tape from the shelf, pressing it flat. And then she washed her hands in the water bucket and dried them on her jeans and went to the truck to find Paul Strickler's number. Strickler took the call without making her wait. She described Pact's visit in full, the offer amount, the mention of the certification lapse, and the comment about county discretion on unused commercial structures. Strickler was quiet for a moment after she finished, and then said that the county comment was what he would call a soft argument rather than a legal one, and that the property's change of ownership and demonstrated active use would work in her favor on any such question. He said 38,000 was a number that would make sense if the land were the only asset, which he noted was a reasonable assumption for someone who had not been inside the pavilion. He said she should not respond to Pact directly and that he would make a note of the contact. Then he said there was someone she should speak with, a woman named Helen Garza, an attorney based in Athens who worked primarily on historic preservation and estate matters. He said her name had come up in a similar context some years back and that she had a reputation for being thorough. He said he had taken the liberty of mentioning Nora's situation to her in general terms and that she was willing to take a call. He gave Nora the number. Nora wrote it on the back of Pact's business card with a carpenter's pencil from the workbench. She called Helen Garza from the payphone on Route 36 the following morning. The attorney answered her own phone, which Nora had not expected. She had a direct voice, economical, the kind of voice that did not waste its own time. She asked 3 questions about the property and 2 about Pact-specific phrasing, and then she said she had driven past Garrity's Park in the summer of 1974 on a family trip, and that she still remembered the music the machine made from the car window. She said it as a plain fact, without decoration. She said she would come out to the property on Thursday if Nora was available. Nora said she was available. She went back to the pavilion after the call and stood in the center of the platform beside the column, the open access panel still visible at its base, the steel plate resting against the column skirt. She had relocked the document box and the canvas bags were back in the cavity, but she had not yet replaced the steel plate or re-driven the lag bolts. She looked at the open space in the column for a moment, and then she picked up the plate and fitted it back into its frame, lining up the bolt holes by feel, and drove the 3 lag bolts home in sequence with the socket wrench, snugging each one evenly until the plate sat flush again. She swung the wooden panel back on its hinges and pressed it shut until the spring lever caught. She stood up and looked at the column. Nothing showed. It was a center column, a decorative skirt, a carved rosette. She picked up the toothbrush and went back to the horses. Helen Garza arrived on Thursday in a gray Volvo wagon with a cracked rear bumper and a back seat full of accordion files. She was 53, compact, with close-cut gray hair and reading glasses on a cord around her neck. She walked the perimeter of the property before she said more than a greeting, the same way Nora had done on her first visit, and when she came back around, she looked at the pavilion roof and said, "That is recent cedar." Nora told her it was Clem's work, probably 89. Helen nodded once, the nod of a person who is confirming something rather than learning it. And then they sat on the tailgate of Nora's truck, and Helen opened one of the accordion files, and they went through the property's legal situation for the better part of an hour. The easement claim Pact had implied was, as Strickler had suggested, a soft argument. The parcel had clear title going back to Opal Truesdale's estate in '58, no recorded easements, no adverse possession claims, no liens. The amusement certification lapse was real but routine. A machine that had been out of operation for 31 years would require inspection before it could carry the public again. But there was no county mechanism for compelling demolition or transfer of a private property on that basis alone. And Helen said she had dealt with larger misrepresentations than that one with considerably less documentation than Nora already had. She said Pact's approach was consistent with a man who made quiet offers early and let ambiguity do most of the work for him. She said he was not the worst she had seen. She said they would file a formal response declining the offer and noting that the property was under active restoration, which would establish a record. She charged $220 for the initial consultation and did not adjust the number when Nora counted out the cash. What happened next happened without anyone organizing it. Earl Dunbar mentioned to a woman named Cecile Ott that the Garrity girl had come to town and was fixing up the park. Cecile Ott was 78 and had lived her whole life in Hester Falls, and she told her daughter, who mentioned it to her neighbor, and by the second week of April there were people stopping along the access track in the afternoon, pulling over without coming through the gate, looking at the pavilion through the fence. Nora noticed them from inside and did not go out immediately. She gave it 3 days. On the 3rd day she opened the gate and left it open. Cecile Ott was the first one in. She was a small woman in a quilted coat who walked with a cane that she did not seem to need very badly, using it more as a prop for emphasis than for support. She went straight to the pavilion without introducing herself and stood inside the doorway looking at the horses. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she had ridden the dapple gray in the middle ring every Saturday for 6 summers running, the one with the blue saddle blanket, and that it was the 3rd horse from the left counting from the door. She and Nora walked to it together, and Nora shone the headlamp on it, and the blue was there, faded to the color of a winter sky, but there. Cecile put her hand on the horse's neck and did not say anything else for a moment. Others came through the open gate over the following days, ones and twos mostly, sometimes a small group that had clearly arrived together from the same conversation. A man named Warren Bolt, who was 66, said Clem had fixed his mother's furnace in January of '74, a gas conversion on an old coal unit, and had refused to bill her. He said his mother had tried to pay 3 times over the following year, and that Clem had declined every time, and that she had never fully understood how to account for that in her sense of how the world operated. A woman in her 40s who had grown up in Cardington said her father had worked one summer painting horses at $1.10 an hour, and that he still had a photograph of himself standing on the platform with a paintbrush in his hand and a look on his face that she described simply as pleased. She said she had never seen that expression on him in any other photograph. Helen Garza filed the response to Pact's offer on April 19th. On the 23rd, Pact's office sent a revised offer of $44,000, which Helen declined by letter without consulting Nora, as they had agreed she could do for any amount below $60,000. On the 30th, a final communication arrived from Pact's office saying that his client wished Nora well with the restoration and that they would not be in contact further. Nora read the letter at the workbench in the pavilion and then put it in the document box with Clem's letter and the drawings and set the box on the shelf above the workbench where the maintenance log lived. She stood back and looked at the shelf for a moment, and then she went back to the horses. The drive belt replacement took 2 full days in the 3rd week of May, with Earl Dunbar's help. He had not offered, and she had not asked. She had mentioned in passing that she was going to start on the motor that weekend, and he had appeared on Saturday morning with a torque wrench and a length of pipe for leverage and a thermos of coffee. The Leeson motor had seized in one of the brush contacts, but Earl cleaned it with electrical contact spray and a piece of 200 grit emery cloth folded to a point, working with the patient precision of a man who had repaired more motors than he could count. The spare belt from the waxed paper wrapper on Clem's shelf was the correct size and seated onto the drive sheave without modification. Earl torqued the motor mount bolts to spec, and they both stood back. Nora threw the disconnect switch on the power panel. The motor turned over once, caught, and the carousel began to move. It started slowly, the way a heavy thing always starts, each horse lifting and falling in sequence as the eccentric mechanism engaged. The platform, rotating on its center, bearing with a sound that was lower and smoother than she had expected. Not a grinding or a complaining sound, but a working sound. The sound of a machine doing what it was built to do. Earl put his hands in his apron pockets and watched it turn. He did not say anything. After a while, Nora reached over and switched it off, and the machine slowed and stopped. One horse at the top of its travel, one at the bottom, the way they had always stopped, the way they had stopped for the last time in September of 1991. On a Tuesday afternoon in early May, the 2nd Tuesday after the machine had run for the first time, Nora arrived at the property to find a woman parked along the access track in a rusted Civic with an out-of-county plate, sitting with the engine running and the window down, looking toward the pavilion. The woman was perhaps 30, in a canvas work jacket, and she had the look of someone who had been on the road for a while and was not sure yet what came next. Nora got out of her truck and walked up to the window, and the woman asked if the park was open. Nora looked at her for a moment. She said it was not open yet, not officially, but that she was welcome to come in if she wanted to see the machine. The woman turned off the Civic and got out. They walked through the gate together and across the crushed limestone and into the pavilion. Nora switched on the shop light and then walked to the power panel and threw the disconnect. The motor caught and the carousel turned, the horses lifting and falling in their slow orbits, the platform rotating in the light. The woman stood at the edge of the platform and watched it for a while without speaking. Then she asked what a ride cost. Nora told her $25. The woman looked at her, not sure if she was serious. Nora said she was serious. The woman reached into her jacket pocket and found $25 and held it out. Nora took it. The woman rode the dapple gray with the blue saddle blanket, the third horse from the left counting from the door. The machine turned in the light, and the afternoon went long and golden through the loose grommets in the canvas, the bars of light moving slowly across the pavilion floor the way they always did, measuring time. Outside, the oaks along the track were in new leaf, that particular green that only lasts 2 weeks in spring, before it deepens into summer and becomes ordinary. The carousel turned. The woman held the brass pole with both hands and looked straight ahead. Some things do not need to be explained to be understood. They only need to be allowed to continue.